we're going to pick up here on how we continue hearing. So in the last video, we made it through the pinna, to the ear canal, to the eardrum, to the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, and then to the cochlea. So that's where we're picking up. The sound waves have now made it to the cochlea, and we're going to see where they make it from here. So we're at the inner ear or the cochlea, that little snail-shaped organ that is in your inner ear. What's going to happen is this cochlea is full of fluid. So the vibrations are going to now transfer into that fluid. So it goes from the solid bones into this liquid in the cochlea structure. And what it's going to do is make a membrane inside of this structure move. So the membrane is the membrane of the organ of Corti. So let's take a look at what we're talking about. So if you look here, this is the cross section of the cochlea, right? And the outside of the cochlea is actually bone. So it's not soft and squishy. A lot of times it looks like in a picture it might be soft and squishy, but it is a bone structure just like the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. So the vibration is going to get transferred there, but the main vibrations are going to go into this fluid section in the center. And the reason why is we want to vibrate this section right here. So you can see that there are these portions of tissue that are attached to the inside of the bone of the cochlea, and then they're attached there to be able to have this section, the organ of Corti, here in the center of the canal. So how is this working? Well, when that membrane moves, it's going to bend hairs. So here is the zoomed in version of this organ of Corti. So here's that membrane that those sound waves are going to bounce. So remember, the sound waves are going to have frequency, so how often they're doing their wave, and they're going to have amplitude, how big they are. And so the amplitude is going to move this membrane more or less, so bigger or lower, right? And the frequency is going to either jiggle it really fast or jiggle it slow, depending on what the sound is. The membrane, what it's jiggling against, are these little guys right here in blue, the hair cells. So the hair cells are our receptor cells. Remember, with senses, the first thing that is going to create the sense is the receptor cell. So it takes us all the way up to this point before we actually get to the receptor cell for our sense of sound. So we have to make it all the way through the cochlea to the organ of Corti to be able to get to these hair cells. So these hair cells are attached to the auditory nerves. So they aren't nerve cells themselves, but they are attached to auditory nerves. And so when this membrane in the organ of Corti bends back and forth, it's going to bend the hairs. So it'll bend the hairs back and forth. That triggers the signal to be sent down the auditory nerve to the brain. And the thing is that, and if you're wondering why you've got this big coil, it's because different parts of the organ of Corti, because the organ of Corti goes all the way through the cochlea, the different parts of it are going to respond to different pitches. So it doesn't all respond to all pitches. So all sounds that you hear aren't heard by the entire cochlea. Oop, sorry. So I just wanted to point out before I jumped ahead These over here, if you were wondering what these little comb shapes are, these are the tips of the hair cells. So you can see that the stuff doesn't all stick up out. So the cells themselves are actually buried in the tissue with the supporting cells. The only thing that sticks out on these that interacts with that membrane are the hairs. So the little parts that bend back and forth. And so these are rows of those hair cells that are found in that organ of corti. So that is how you hear, right? So you're going to have that sound transfer all the way through until we get here to the cochlea. That membrane is going to vibrate, and when it hits those hairs, it's going to bend the hairs, which will trigger the auditory nerves and send that signal to the brain. Okay, so what happens to cause hearing loss then? So when we talked about vision, we talked about different ways that your vision could be affected. Well, your hearing can be affected as well. So when we call it hearing loss, this is a loss of only part of the hearing spectrum. So you can hear, right, 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. So you can hear that whole range. But if you lose part of it, that's when we call it hearing loss. And it may be reversible depending on why you lost it. So it might be possible to get that part of your range back, just depending on what caused the damage and how the damage was repaired or could be repaired. So a couple of things can cause hearing loss. The most common one is increasing age. So as you age, we see more and more people with hearing loss. So a third of people that are in that 65 to 75 age bracket have some level of hearing loss. So they've lost some part of that 20 to 20,000 hertz range. This is why when, for example, we were listening to, in the previous video, that sound recording of the 20 to 20,000 hertz, I said, you know, I can't hear it anymore, but many of you can. I'm older than most of you. And so I've actually already lost part of that spectrum, and I'm not in this age bracket yet. But as we age, we lose some of it. And you lose more as you get older. This is because the structures just break down. So as you age, just like with vision, with vision, your lenses break down, the muscles get weaker, you may build up cataracts. With hearing loss, the structures break down, your hair cells, start to get damaged, your eardrum probably has accumulated damage. So you're going to start having hearing loss issues because you've just accumulated damage to the structures related to those hearing structures. Many of you have probably experienced this one. So if you have exposure to loud noise, that can create hearing loss. And that's because it damages cells of the inner ear. If you actually expose your hearing system to too high of an amplitude, it can be too much. Basically, if you think about it like this, you've got that membrane, right? And that membrane is flapping up and down in response to the sound waves coming in. If it hits too hard or too often, then it can damage the cells. And that's actually what you're seeing over here. The top are healthy hair cells. So you can see again those little rows of like little teeth. The bottom, these are hair cells that have been damaged by loud noise. Now, if it's just something like a concert for a short period of time, more than likely it's just temporary and your hair cells will regenerate because you've probably just done, a little bit of banging around on them and they just need some time to recuperate. If, on the other hand, you are being exposed repeatedly to loud noise, like on a job or something like that, without ear protection, then this can be permanent because you possibly have damaged them to the point where the hair cells can't recover. High fevers, these can actually create hearing loss because they damage the cochlea. So they damage the structures inside of the cochlea. This is actually a common thing from fevers from things like meningitis and some other childhood illnesses can create this kind of problem. And then infections. Different types of infections can cause problems, especially for eardrums. So that's what you're seeing in this picture here, if you were wondering. This is actually a rupture right here, a tear in an eardrum. And if you rupture or tear your eardrum, you're going to experience hearing loss because your eardrum is not going to be able to vibrate correctly. That whole section needs to be stretched taut, just like on a drum. And so if it's got a rupture in it, you're not going to be able to basically hear because you won't have anything to be able to vibrate. You also, with infections, can also create damage to your inner ear cells. Different infections, the microbes might do damage. Your high fever may do some damage by, basically nuking cells, cooking them. Very often there is hearing loss associated with individuals who had lots of ear infections as children. Some of you may have had tubes put in your ears when you were a kid. That's usually because you had a lot of ear infections and they wanted to make sure that the fluid didn't build up in your ears because that can damage the ear structures, things like your eardrums and so forth. I can tell you that, for example, I know some of my hearing loss is actually due to scars on my eardrums from ear infections. So those kinds of things can happen. And if it's something like a scar, that is not reversible. However, if it's something like short-term damage where, like I said, if it's like a concert or something where you just have done a little bit of damage, the cells may be able to recover. So hearing loss, that's loss of only part of the hearing spectrum. Deafness, on the other hand, this is complete or nearly complete loss of hearing. So you can be considered deaf, just like you can be considered blind and still be able to hear a little bit of the auditory range. This can be genetic. So there are people who are deaf at birth or starting in early childhood where they lose their hearing over time. This is usually due to missing hair cells, or the hair cells come in malformed, meaning that instead of the hairs being straight, they are bent or curled or, some shape other than the straight shape that they're supposed to be for that membrane to come in and hit and bend. So that is one of the common ones that we see for deafness, but it can also be environmental. So if you take certain medications, some medications can actually damage hair cells to the point where it can create hearing loss to the level of deafness, and extreme sound exposure. So again, if you are, on a job of some sort where you're getting repetitive loud sound exposure, that can create deafness as well. So, are there ways to treat hearing loss? And yeah, you probably are a little familiar with some of these. The most common way to treat it is with a hearing aid. So this is an older style hearing aid, but all of them have the same sort of components. My dad actually has gotten hearing aids recently. They are tiny, but work the same way. So all hearing aids have a battery, obviously, but they're going to have a microphone. So that way they can bring in the sound waves. So that makes sense, right? Because that's the first part of the whole hearing process. So they're going to have at least one microphone, usually more than one, so that you can get that 3D sound pickup. Then they're going to have an amplifier. So they're going to have a small part of electronic gear in them so that it will amplify the sound, because sometimes the problem is that the hammer, anvil, and stirrup aren't going to be enough to amplify the sound to fix the hearing loss issue. And so that amplifier is going to boost the signal going in, and then it's going to send it to the speaker, and the speaker is going to be pointed into the ear canal, and it will send those amplified, boosted sound waves into the ear for the individual. And very often these actually do have the ability to be turned up and turned down. I know a couple people in my family who have the ability to turn theirs off if they want to, and sometimes they do. But these can be used if you don't have permanent hearing loss. Now, there are hearing loss treatments for individuals who have hearing loss due to the damage to, parts of their hearing system that basically create deafness. And as long as the cochlea is not damaged, then they can actually do these kinds of implants. So this is a cochlear implant, and I've seen students, and I used to work at COSI, so I used to have students in my assemblies and so forth that had these. They're kind of cool in a way, because what they do is the implant is actually inside of their brain. So you can see over here, they have a receiver and stimulator actually inside of their head, and that has been fed down into the cochlea. So it basically bypasses everything and is curled around inside of the cochlea. This is so that the stimulation can go straight there. So the electrodes are what's in the cochlea, and so it's going to send the signals right there to the cochlea and fire, so that, because remember, the hair cells are usually the part that are broken, so instead it's going to fire the electrical signals for the auditory nerves. So the auditory nerves will pick up the signals that are being fired and send them to the brain. On the outside, what you'll see is they'll have a transmitter. It's usually magnetized. And so they have a transmitter that's hooked up to an earpiece that looks like a hearing aid. But what that is a microphone. So that way, and a little processor, so that way it can send the data to the transmitter and then into the receiver. Sometimes these aren't necessarily little microphones that they wear. Sometimes they are packs that, like an instructor or something like that would wear, that will send the signal straight to their transmitter. So these can actually help people who are deaf be able to hear, because they're sending that signal straight into the cochlea to be able to be sent straight to the brain. All right, that finishes up hearing.